At the start of the Korean War, North Korean forces launched a simultaneous barrage along the 38th parallel north. Shortly afterwards, a massive army of tens of thousands crossed the 38th parallel north and invaded south with furious force. The North Korean military believed that capturing Seoul would decide the outcome of the war and had made detailed plans before the war began. The forces responsible for capturing Seoul were primarily established within North Korea. They advanced to surround Seoul, cutting off the South Korean army's retreat. In addition, troops returning from overseas were stationed around Seoul and deployed to areas outside of Seoul. In other words, the North Korean military was aiming to surround Seoul in 2 layers. The South Korean military, on the other hand, had also stationed forces at the 38th parallel north. However, at that time, clashes between the North and South Korean armies were occurring frequently over a long period of time. As a result, many people thought this is probably just another provocation by the North Korean military. Furthermore, at the start of the war, many soldiers were away from the front lines on leave or on tours. In addition, 1/3 of the equipment had also been sent behind the 38th parallel north for maintenance. As a result of these circumstances, the North Korean invasion came as a complete surprise to the South Korean side. The South Korean side's response was significantly delayed, and the situation quickly fell into chaos. The South Korean government took the situation seriously and immediately requested assistance from the United States and the United Nations. At that time, when President Truman received reports that North Korea had invaded the South, he immediately deemed it a serious crisis. He believed the attack was backed by the Soviet Union. He also believed that if the United States did not take countermeasures there, the Soviet Union would repeat its aggression in other regions. The basic principle of U.S. security policy at the time was that the United States will defend its allies. Therefore, if the United States were to abandon the Korean Peninsula, it would affect America's credibility and risk the collapse of the alliance system itself. Moreover, following the communistization of China, the United States felt a strong sense of crisis about the situation in East Asia. North Korea's actions also posed a clear challenge to the authority of the fledgling United Nations. If we do not counter this blatant act of aggression, it will have a negative impact on the entire international order. Truman made this judgment and viewed the situation not simply as a civil war on the Korean Peninsula but as an invasion by communist forces. President Truman therefore decided to immediately send U.S. naval and air forces to the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. Navy's Far East Naval Forces, which was ordered to deploy, sent part of the U.S. 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait and deployed its main force to Korean waters. The United States made clear its determination to prevent the spread of communism in the Pacific region. The United States immediately called on the United Nations to convene a Security Council. The United States has strongly condemned North Korea's actions, viewing them as a clear violation of international peace and an act of aggression. Furthermore, the United States proposed a resolution calling on North Korea to cease hostilities and immediately withdraw its troops, urging the international community to take action. When the United States began to influence the United Nations in this way, the Soviet Union became the most impatient. At the time, the Soviet Union was protesting the Republic of China's retention of a permanent seat on the Security Council even after the Chinese Revolution. So they were boycotting Security Council meetings. However, this boycott worked to the Soviet Union's disadvantage in an unexpected way. Because the Soviets were absent from the conference, they could not veto power the resolution proposed by the United States. This was a very advantageous situation for the United States at the United Nations. As a result, the conference proceeded without the Soviet Union present, and the U.S. proposals were passed one after another. Thus, the United Nations recommended that member states provide necessary assistance to South Korea to eliminate armed attacks and restore peace. Furthermore, military assistance will be provided under the U.S.-led United Nations Command. The commander will also be appointed by the United States. Thus, the Korean War developed into an international issue, and its impact naturally reached China as well. Initially, China viewed the Korean War as a civil war within the Korean Peninsula. However, with the United States beginning to intervene, the situation is no longer something that concerns them. In particular, the deployment of the U.S. 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait made them very wary. They felt that American influence was closing in on them from three directions: Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam. They became aware of a major threat. As a result, they decided to postpone their originally planned operation to liberate Taiwan and instead focus on strengthening the defenses of the northeastern region. Additionally, they provided military assistance to Vietnam to stabilize the border area and prepare to focus on the situation on the Korean peninsula. Then, public opinion and trends within the country gradually shifted toward countering the United States and aiding North Korea. However, their higher priority was the pacification of Taiwan and Tibet. Their intervention in the Korean War would have given the United States an excuse to attack mainland China. It also threatened to give momentum to Chiang Kai-shek's counterattack on the mainland policy. For these reasons, China was cautious in refraining from taking action at that stage. Even as the international situation changed dramatically, the North Korean army continued its relentless advance, eventually approaching Seoul. There were two main routes that the North Korean army could take to attack Seoul. Geographically, whichever route they took, they would eventually meet up north of Seoul. Therefore, the South Korean military decided that this northern defense line must be defended to the death and began preparations. The North Korean military also concentrated its elite troops in an attempt to break through the area. The problem here was that the North Korean forces included tank units. At the time, many of the South Korean military had little experience of seeing a tank. They realized that their equipment was no match for the enemy and panic set in at the front lines. In response to this situation, the South Korean military leadership held an emergency meeting. They considered the crucial policy of whether to defend Seoul or abandon it. However, with the north side of Seoul already collapsing and North Korean forces approaching the city, it was impossible to continue the defense. They finally decided that the South Korean military as an organized military force had collapsed. A policy was then decided to withdraw the government and military headquarters south to await the arrival of U.S. forces. Thus began the South Korean government's plan to escape from Seoul. The government first headed to Suwon, intending to use it as a temporary base. Plans were then made for United Nations forces and South Korean forces to build a defensive line in Daejeon to hold off the North Korean forces. Meanwhile, the North Korean army continued its attack on Seoul, and succeeded in taking the capital just 3 days after the start of the war. There was a huge difference in military power between the North and the South. The war progressed with North Korea in an overwhelming position of superiority. However, the United States did not simply stand by and watch the North Korean army advance. The U.S. Far East Air Forces immediately advanced into the skies over the Korean peninsula and seized air superiority. They then used B-29s, an aircraft launched from aircraft carrier to destroy North Korean airfields, railways, and supply bases one after another. In this way, North Korea's supply lines were completely destroyed. Meanwhile, the North Korean army believed that with its occupation of Seoul, most of the war was over. The communists hiding in the south will rise up. They thought, we can take advantage of the confusion to further expand our military gains, and so remained in Seoul. However, once the U.S. military began to intervene in earnest, the North Korean military also noticed a change in the situation. They hastily restarted their southward advance. Although the United States deployed its Navy and Air Force early on, they were cautious about deploying full-scale ground forces. This is because they were concerned about the South Korean military, which was already in disarray. If they simply lacked military strength, the United States could make up for it with reinforcements. However, if their fighting spirit had been lost, American aid would have been meaningless. Therefore, Douglas MacArthur General flew from Tokyo to Korea to see the situation for himself. He then inspected the area around Seoul, which had just fallen. During this inspection, he asked a nearby South Korean sergeant how long they could defend the Han River. The sergeant replied, "Sir, I'm a soldier. If the company commander orders me to defend this place, I will defend it until I die. If the company commander orders me to retreat, I will retreat." After this exchange, Douglas MacArthur General decided that the South Korean military still had the will to fight. He cabled Washington that ground troops were needed. Upon receiving it, President Truman concluded, The North Korean military has not stopped its advance despite the UN resolution, so we should send in ground troops. He then officially decided to send in ground troops. As a result, U.S. ground forces stationed in Japan under the command of Douglas MacArthur General were sent to the Korean peninsula,